There are moments in life where a simple act of kindness can change your destiny forever. This is the story of Daniel, a 28-year-old young man who defended a stranger on the street, without knowing that decision would open the doors to his future. Welcome back. Tell me what city you're watching from, and what time it is there. Now listen to this story. It was a gray November morning in Mexico City. Daniel Hernandez adjusted his tie for the third time in front of the fogged mirror of his small bathroom. The reflection staring back showed a young man with deep dark circles under his eyes, and an expression that mixed hope with desperation. His apartment in the Roma neighborhood was barely 20 square meters of harsh reality. The walls were covered with motivational posters he had printed at a nearby print shop. "Success is the sum of small efforts," read one of them, while another proclaimed, "Your attitude determines your altitude." But that morning, not all the posters in the world could calm the nerves gnawing at his stomach. On his cheap wooden desk, a calendar showed 9 months of interviews marked with red circles. 9 months of polite rejections, of phrases like "we'll be in touch" that never materialized into phone calls, of sleepless nights wondering what he was doing wrong. His business administration degree hung on the wall as a constant reminder of his dreams and the family pressure he carried on his shoulders. His parents, workers at a textile factory in Naucalpan, had sacrificed everything so he could study. Every peso they had invested in his education was an emotional debt that Daniel felt growing day by day. Have you ever felt like that? With that pressure of not disappointing those who have believed in you? That morning's interview was different. Innovatex, a technology company located in Polanco, had shown real interest in his profile. It wasn't just another courtesy interview. Daniel had researched the company for weeks. He knew they specialized in sustainable technologies, and had a strong commitment to social responsibility. It was exactly the kind of place he dreamed of working. He kept his resume in a plastic folder he had used so many times. The edges were starting to fray. His hands trembled slightly as he closed his apartment door. The subway waited for him, and with it another opportunity to change his life. The journey from Roma Norte to Polanco was a trip between two worlds. Daniel watched through the subway window as modest buildings gave way to towers of glass and steel. Each station brought him closer to a future that seemed tangible but always elusive. He arrived at Polanco station 20 minutes early. Perfect. He would have time to review his answers once more, to convince himself that this time would be different. But fate had other plans. 2 blocks before reaching the Innovatex building, Daniel stopped dead. On the opposite sidewalk, in front of an elegant café, an older woman was being surrounded by 3 young men, gesticulating aggressively. Their voices rose above the traffic noise, and although Daniel couldn't hear the exact words, their body language said it all. The woman, elegantly dressed in a navy blue suit and carrying a genuine leather purse, maintained her composure despite being visibly uncomfortable. Her gray hair was perfectly styled, and her hands, adorned with discreet but obviously expensive rings, trembled slightly as she held her purse handles. The 3 young men, dressed in expensive but carelessly worn sportswear, had cornered her against the café wall. Their gestures were threatening, though Daniel didn't detect any intention of physical violence. It was something worse. Public humiliation. "You owe us an apology," shouted the tallest of the young men, a guy about 20 years old wearing an international brand cap. "Because of you we lost our job. All because you didn't like us." The woman shook her head, trying to explain something in a calm voice, but the young men wouldn't let her speak. The second one, stockier, mocked, "Sure, now you're going to say it wasn't your fault. People like you always find excuses." Daniel felt a familiar warmth in his chest. It was the same sensation he had experienced in school, when he saw bullies picking on smaller children, the same indignation that had led him to defend his younger sister when neighbors made fun of her worn-out shoes. He looked at his watch. 15 minutes until the interview. If he got involved he might be late. Everything he had planned, all the preparation, could be ruined in a moment of impulse. But the woman looked up and for an instant their eyes met. In her eyes Daniel saw something he immediately recognized, the loneliness of someone facing injustice without anyone to back them up. He couldn't keep walking. "Excuse me," said Daniel as he approached the group. His voice sounded firmer than he felt. "And your job this Monday is to present our current approach in a way that convinces them Pyron efficient methods are actually more effective long-term." Daniel spent the entire weekend immersed in data, reports, testimonials, and outcome measurements from every program Innovatex had implemented over the past 5 years. He interviewed community leaders by phone, reviewed academic research on sustainable development, and analyzed case studies from other companies that had taken similar investment dollars. What he found reinforced everything he had been learning in his short time at the company. Programs built on authentic relationships and cultural understanding had dramatically higher success rates, better community satisfaction, and more sustainable outcomes than programs implemented through standardized approaches. But he also found something troubling. The investors had reason to be skeptical. Several other socially responsible companies had used similar language to Innovatex but had delivered disappointing results when scaled up. Monday morning arrived faster than Daniel wanted. He met Teresa in her office at 7 a.m. to do a final review of their presentation. "Are you ready?" she asked, looking as calm as always but with a slight tightness around her eyes that revealed her own nerves. "As ready as I can be," Daniel replied truthfully. "But Teresa, I need to know something before we go into this meeting. If they reject our proposal and walk away from the investment, will that put the company in a difficult position?" Teresa considered the question carefully. "It will mean growing more slowly than we planned. It will mean turning down some opportunities to help communities that we could have helped with their funding. It will mean being more creative about finding alternative resources." She paused. "But it won't mean compromising who we are." The investors arrived precisely at 9 a.m. 3 men and 2 women, all impeccably dressed, all carrying tablets and smartphones they checked continuously throughout introductions. They were professional, polite, and projected an air of having seen every conceivable business proposal multiple times before. The lead investor, a man named Robert Harrison, had graying hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. His handshake was firm but brief, and Daniel immediately sensed he was someone who valued efficiency above relationship building. "Ms. Morales, Mr. Morales, Ms. Hernandez," he said after introductions were complete, "we've reviewed your materials extensively. Innovatex has impressive results, but we believe there are significant opportunities to scale those results more effectively. We're eager to hear your thoughts," Teresa responded diplomatically. The presentation began with Robert outlining their investment philosophy and previous successful partnerships. Every example they shared emphasized rapid growth, wide coverage, and impressive quantified outcomes. "Our analysis suggests," said Patricia Wong, one of the female investors, "that Innovatex could triple its impact within 18 months by implementing proven efficiency measures we've used with other partners." Daniel felt his hands sweating as his turn approached. Everything the investors had said sounded logical, impressive, and designed to help more people. How could he argue against helping more families? But then he remembered Don Aurelio's worried expression when he talked about changes dividing his community. He remembered Doña Esperanza asking specifically that technology serve their community without changing their identity. He remembered Emilio's careful questions about whether outside solutions would respect local wisdom. "Thank you for sharing your approach," Daniel began when Teresa introduced him. "Before I discuss our methodology, I'd like to show you something." He had prepared a video testimonial from San Miguel Tilquiapan, but not the typical promotional video of happy families thanking the company for their help. Instead, it showed Don Aurelio explaining to his grandson how the solar energy project had actually strengthened traditional practices by giving families more secure access to electricity for preserving traditional crafts that required detailed work and good lighting. It showed Doña Esperanza describing how the community meetings required for managing the technology had become occasions where older women mentored younger women about child rearing while learning to use tablets for tracking energy usage. Most importantly, it showed Emilio explaining how the project had increased young people's pride in their community and traditions, rather than making them want to leave for urban areas. "Our approach takes longer initially," Daniel acknowledged after the video, "because we spend whatever time is necessary to understand how each community functions, what their specific needs are, and how any intervention can strengthen rather than disrupt their existing social structures." Patricia Wong looked skeptical. "But that approach doesn't scale efficiently. If you spend 3 months understanding each community before implementing solutions, you can only help so many communities per year." "That's true," agreed Daniel. "But here's what we've learned. Communities where we've taken that time show 94% program sustainability 5 years later. Communities where we've tried to implement standard solutions more rapidly show only 38% sustainability after the same time frame." He brought up charts showing long-term outcomes from both approaches. "So while we can help fewer communities initially, the communities we help achieve lasting change that doesn't require ongoing intervention. Communities where we use standardized approaches often regress to previous conditions once external support ends." Robert Harrison leaned forward, interested despite obvious skepticism. "Those are impressive statistics, but how do you ensure consistency across different implementations? How do you maintain quality control if every program is customized?" Daniel had anticipated this question. "We maintain consistency in our values and principles, not in our specific tactics. Every program must demonstrate respect for local knowledge, must strengthen community decision-making capacity, and must create economic opportunities that align with traditional practices. But tactics vary dramatically based on what each community needs and values." Another investor, Marcos Reed, spoke up. "That sounds like a management nightmare. How do you train staff to work so flexibly? How do you measure progress when expectations are different for each community?" Teresa intervened smoothly. "Marcos, would you allow Daniel to show you our staff development and measurement approaches?" For the next hour, Daniel found himself in the most intense professional conversation of his life. The investors challenged every aspect of their methodology, questioned every assumption, and pushed for harder data on every claim. But Daniel discovered something surprising. Defending something he deeply believed in came naturally. Every question they raised reminded him of specific community members he had met, concrete problems they had shared, and real solutions that had emerged from community-based approaches. When Marcus asked how they could guarantee results without standardized processes, Daniel described how San Miguel Tilquiapan's community-managed solar project had led to them designing their own workshop for maintaining the equipment, which had led to a small business repairing systems for other communities, which had led to young people staying instead of migrating for work. Could we have predicted that specific outcome when we started the project? Admitted Daniel. No. Could we have achieved it if we had tried to implement a predetermined solution? Absolutely not. When Patricia wondered about cost effectiveness, Daniel showed data demonstrating that while their initial per-community investment was higher, the total cost per family helped over 5 years was actually 40% lower due to program sustainability. At the end of 2 hours, the investors asked for time to deliberate privately. Daniel and Teresa left them in the conference room and walked to Teresa's office. How do you think it went? Daniel asked, feeling emotionally exhausted. You represented our values beautifully, Teresa replied. Whether they understand the value of those values remains to be seen. They waited. Clara brought coffee and tried to make small talk, but neither Daniel nor Teresa could concentrate on anything other than the decision being made down the hall. Finally, Robert Harrison called to ask them to rejoin the meeting. Miss Morales, Mr. Hernandez, he began when they were seated. We want to be completely transparent about our position. Daniel's heart sank. That sounded like the beginning of a rejection. Your approaches are thoughtful, and your outcomes are impressive within the communities you've served. We admire the care you've taken to achieve sustainable results. But, with the resources we could provide, you could help 50 times more families. Yes, your individualized approach shows better long-term results, but the scale of global poverty requires solutions that can be deployed broadly. Marcus nodded. Every month you spend getting to know one community represents hundreds of other families that could be receiving help. Daniel felt compelled to speak.
With respect, you're assuming that broader deployment automatically means helping more people. But if programs don't achieve sustainable results, then all you're doing is helping more people temporarily, while consuming resources that could have created lasting change. Robert raised his hand diplomatically. We understand your perspective, and we have a proposal that we believe could address both concerns. He opened his tablet and projected some notes onto the room screen. We're prepared to make the full investment under modified terms. Innovatex would implement its customized approach in, let's say, 20 carefully selected communities. Meanwhile, with remaining funds, you would also pilot more streamlined approaches in 30 additional communities. Think of it as controlled research, added Patricia. After 2 years, we could compare outcomes from both methodologies and then decide how to allocate future resources. Teresa and Daniel looked at each other. It wasn't the complete rejection they had feared, but it also wasn't a complete acceptance of their approach. We'd need creative freedom to design both tracks, said Teresa carefully. Of course, agreed Robert, as long as the streamlined approaches still receive adequate resources for fair comparison. Daniel realized this was probably the best offer they were going to get. Teresa seemed to be thinking the same thing. Can we have until tomorrow to consider your proposal? Asked Teresa. Absolutely, said Robert. This is a big decision for everyone involved. After the investors left, Daniel and Teresa sat in silence for several minutes. What do you think? Teresa asked finally. Daniel had been wrestling with the same question. It feels like a compromise that might work, he admitted. 20 communities developed our way is 20 more communities that receive the kind of attention and respect they deserve. And if our approach really is more effective, the comparison results should demonstrate that clearly. My concern, said Teresa, is that running parallel programs could create internal tensions. Staff working on streamlined programs might feel like they're delivering inferior service. Communities might hear about other communities receiving more individualized attention and feel shortchanged. Daniel nodded. Those were real risks. But also, continued Teresa, 50 communities helped poorly might still be better than 20 communities helped well, if the need is great enough. It was the fundamental dilemma of social work. Perfection versus scale, quality versus quantity, depth versus breadth. Teresa, said Daniel after more reflection, what if we approach this as a genuine research opportunity? What if we dedicate ourselves to documenting every aspect of both approaches, measuring every outcome we can think of, and then sharing those results publicly? What do you mean? I mean, what if we use this 2-year pilot to create a definitive case study about community-based development, something that other organizations could use to make their own decisions about methodology? Teresa's expression brightened slightly. So instead of just proving that our approach works for our investors, prove that our approach works for the entire development sector. Exactly. Turn the compromise into a learning opportunity that benefits everyone. Teresa smiled fully for the first time that day. Daniel, I think you might have just figured out how to turn a potentially problematic investment into a genuinely valuable contribution to the field. They spent the rest of that day planning how to structure the dual approach in a way that would serve both communities effectively while generating valuable research. The next morning they called Robert Harrison and accepted the investment with their proposed modifications. 6 months later, Daniel found himself standing in the town square of a small community called San Jose de la Cruz, watching a celebration that perfectly illustrated why their community-based approach was proving successful. The community had received their second round of funding for an expanded renewable energy project, but instead of simply installing more solar panels, they had designed a system of energy sharing between 3 neighboring communities that preserved each village's independence while creating economic interdependence. Young people from San Jose had trained as technicians and were now earning steady incomes maintaining systems throughout the region. Older residents had turned traditional crafts into small businesses that could operate with reliable electricity, and children were using internet access to connect with their cousins in other communities rather than solely with urban centers. Meanwhile, Daniel had also been tracking progress in the streamlined program communities. Results were
communities where standardized interventions aligned well with existing needs and structures were showing good results. But communities where the predetermined solutions didn't quite fit were struggling, and some were beginning to request modifications that looked increasingly similar to Innovatex's traditional customized approach. More importantly, Daniel was documenting everything: what worked, what didn't work, and why. He was building a comprehensive database of lessons learned that could guide future development work throughout Latin America. His phone buzzed with a text from Teresa. "Investors arriving for their 6-month review tomorrow. Are you ready?" Daniel looked around at the celebration happening in San Jose Square. Children were playing games powered by renewable energy. Adults were sharing traditional food prepared with electric equipment, and several generations were working together to manage technology that had strengthened rather than disrupted their community bonds. "Yes," he texted back. "I'm ready. But life has a way of testing you right when you think you have everything figured out." 2 hours after sending that confident text message, Daniel received a phone call that changed everything. "Daniel," said a voice he recognized as Emilio from San Miguel Tilquiapan, "we need your help. There's been a situation." Daniel immediately headed north toward San Miguel, his mind racing with worry about what could have gone wrong. The 3-hour drive felt interminable. When he arrived, he found the community in crisis. A government inspector had arrived unannounced and declared that their community-managed solar installation was non-compliant with federal regulations. He was threatening to shut down the system indefinitely, unless it was properly certified by an approved contractor from the capital, at a cost that would bankrupt the project. But here's what Daniel discovered when he spoke with residents. The inspector was the older brother of one of the young men who had been humiliating Teresa Morales on the street months earlier. "He heard about our success," explained Don Aurelio with barely concealed anger, "and decided we must be breaking some law. He's been searching for weeks to find something he could use against us." Daniel felt a familiar fire in his chest. This was exactly the kind of abuse of power that made sustainable development so difficult. But unlike dealing with 3 young men on a city street, taking on a government inspector who was abusing his position required different tactics entirely. "What evidence can we gather about his motivations?" Daniel asked Emilio. Over the next day, working with community members, Daniel documented a pattern of harassment that went far beyond normal inspection procedures. The inspector had demanded access to community financial records that were completely beyond his jurisdiction, had threatened residents with personal legal action, and had made statements suggesting his actions were motivated by resentment rather than legitimate regulatory concerns. More importantly, Daniel discovered that several other communities with renewable energy projects had faced similar intimidation from the same inspector. This wasn't just about San Miguel Tilquiapan. It was about whether community-controlled development projects would be allowed to exist at all. Daniel called Teresa. "We need lawyers, we need media attention, and we need political support. But most importantly, we need to coordinate with other affected communities to show this is a pattern of abuse." Teresa was quiet for a moment. "Daniel, are you sure this is the fight we want to take on? This could attract exactly the kind of government attention that interferes with all our programs." Daniel understood her concern. Fighting a government inspector could lead to increased scrutiny of all Innovatex operations. It could jeopardize their new investment, their expansion plans, the people they were helping. But he also understood something else. If they didn't fight this battle, then every community-based program they developed would be vulnerable to the same intimidation. "Teresa," he said, "remember what you told me about maintaining our values even when it's inconvenient?" "Yes, this is one of those moments." Teresa sighed. "You're right. And after watching you handle equally challenging situations over the past 6 months, I trust your judgment. What do you need?" What followed were 2 intense weeks that Daniel would later describe as the most important education he had received about how real social change happens. Working with Innovatex's legal team, Daniel helped coordinate responses from 7 different communities that had faced similar harassment. They documented everything, filed formal complaints with appropriate oversight agencies, and most importantly, generated media attention that attracted support from indigenous rights organizations and environmental groups throughout Mexico. The investors from Europe and America watched these developments with initial worry, then growing respect. Instead of a company that avoided conflict to protect its bottom line, they saw a company that was willing to defend its mission, even when personally costly. The government inspector was eventually removed from his position after a formal investigation confirmed abuse of his authority. More importantly, the publicity around the case led to new policies protecting community-managed development projects from harassment by local officials. But the real victory came during the investors' 6-month review meeting. Ms. Morales, Mr. Hernandez, said Robert Harrison, when we initially considered investing in Innovatex, we were impressed by your results but concerned about scalability. Daniel braced himself for whatever was coming. After watching how you've handled simultaneous expansion while defending community rights, we've reached a new conclusion about scalability. Patricia Wong took over. The kind of scale that matters isn't just reaching more communities faster. It's creating a sustainable model that can be replicated by other organizations while maintaining quality and integrity, which is exactly what you've been doing, added Marcus Reed. Your documentation of community-based methodologies is becoming a resource that other development organizations are already requesting access to. Robert nodded. We want to expand our investment and focus completely on your customized approach. The streamlined programs, while showing some success, are demonstrating exactly what you predicted. Impressive short-term results but poor long-term sustainability. Teresa and Daniel looked at each other in amazement. Are you saying, Teresa asked carefully, that you want to fund only community-based programs going forward? We're saying, replied Robert, that you've proven that community-based programs are more scalable than standardized programs, once you factor in long-term sustainability and replication by other organizations. 6 months after that meeting, Daniel stood once again in the town square of San Jose de la Cruz, but this time it wasn't just San Jose celebrating. Representatives from 37 communities were gathered for the first Inter-Community Sustainable Development Festival, sharing success stories, traditional crafts, renewable energy innovations, and educational materials their communities had developed. Young people who had learned technical skills in their home villages were teaching those skills to residents from other communities. Older adults were sharing traditional knowledge about sustainable agriculture that complemented modern techniques. And children were performing traditional dances and music for audiences that included their own families, neighboring communities, and visitors from several continents who had come to learn about community-based development. Teresa joined Daniel at a small table where he was reviewing documentation from 2 years of program implementations. Any regrets? She asked in her characteristic direct manner. Daniel looked around at the celebration, thought about the communities that were thriving, remembered the families he had met, considered the challenges they had faced and overcome. About defending someone who needed help on a busy street 9 months ago, he asked. About taking a job where I get to work with communities like these? About fighting for programs that actually serve people instead of just serving politicians. He paused and smiled. My only regret is that it took me 9 months of job searching to find this place. Teresa laughed. And my only regret is that it took me 35 years of running this company to find someone who understood instinctively what real community development looks like. But as perfect as that moment felt, Daniel knew that success in social work is never permanent. There would always be new challenges, new communities to serve, new fights for protecting community rights. His phone buzzed with a text message that proved his point immediately. Daniel, the message read, this is Emilio from San Miguel Tilquiapan. We have a group of government officials here who are asking about replicating our energy program in other states. They want to meet with you next week, but they want to streamline the community involvement process. Can you come and help us explain why that won't work? Daniel showed the message to Teresa. Ready for another fight? She asked. Daniel looked around at 37 communities that had found ways to combine tradition with innovation, dignity with progress, economic development with cultural preservation. Always, he replied. As the celebration continued around them, Daniel reflected on how much his life had changed since that morning when he had faced a choice between personal convenience and helping a stranger. He had learned that real success wasn't about individual achievement, but about contributing to something larger than yourself. He had learned that sustainable change required deep respect for existing communities and relationships. And he had learned that sometimes the most important decisions we make are the ones where we choose to pay attention to other people's dignity even when no one is watching. Most importantly, he had learned that meaningful work requires both competence and courage. Competence to understand complex problems deeply, and courage to take action even when the path forward is uncertain. Has there been a moment in your life when a simple act of kindness opened doors you never expected, a decision to help someone else that ended up transforming your own future? Daniel's story reminds us that our character is revealed not in the things we do when people are watching, but in the things we do when we think no one will ever know. Sometimes, helping a stranger on a busy street isn't just about that moment. Sometimes it's about who you choose to become. Today, Daniel continues working at Innovatex, now as Director of Community Development. The programs he helped to design are being replicated throughout Latin America. And 2 weeks ago, he received a call from a recent university graduate who had heard about their work. "My name is Ana," she said. "I've been looking for a job where I can make a real difference. But I want to know, what is it really like to work someplace where you never have to compromise your values?" Daniel smiled, remembering his own desperate job search just 2 years earlier. "It's challenging," he told her. "It requires you to think deeply, work creatively, and sometimes fight for what you believe in. But if you're willing to do those things, it's the most satisfying work you can imagine." "I'm willing," Ana replied without hesitation. "Then come in for an interview," Daniel said. "But before you do, let me ask you something. If you saw a person being treated unfairly on the street, what would you do?" "I'd help them," Ana replied immediately. "I wouldn't be able to just walk away." "Then you'll fit in perfectly here," Daniel told her. "Some stories end with a single moment of triumph, others end with a single moment of realization. But the best stories, ones quanchas most fundamentally, end with a commitment to continue minority, to daily choose to see other people as worthy of dignity, to consistently choose community over convenience, to repeatedly choose courage over comfort." Daniel's story ends where it began, with a choice to pay attention to other people's humanity, especially when it costs us something to do so. Have you ever lived through or known someone who has gone through something similar? A situation where doing the right thing wasn't the most convenient, but turned out to be the most important? I invite you to share your own story in the comments. Every act of kindness, every moment where we choose empathy over indifference, every decision to defend those who need our help, all these small decisions create a world where every person can find their place and their purpose. And if this story touched your heart, if it made you reflect on the moments in your own life where you've had to choose between personal convenience and doing what was right, give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear that their acts of kindness really matter. Subscribe for more stories about people who discovered that the smallest moments of human decency can open the biggest doors of opportunity and change. Because in the end, we're all looking for our place in the world. And sometimes the most unexpected way to find that place is helping someone else find theirs first. "Is there a problem in here?" The young man with the cap turned around with a defiant expression. "This is none of your business, sir. We're talking to the lady about something personal." "I get the impression the lady would prefer this conversation not continue," Daniel responded, positioning himself so he formed a subtle barrier between the young man and the woman. "And you're attracting too much attention." It was true. Several passers-by had stopped to observe, though they maintained the prudent distance characteristic of inhabitants of any large city. Daniel knew that attention didn't favor the young man. "And what are you going to do about it?" asked the second young man, puffing out his chest. "Are you going to hit us?" Daniel smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile he had learned on the streets of his neighborhood, the one that said, "I'm not looking for trouble, but I'm not afraid of you." "I don't need to hit anyone," he said calmly. "You're 3 young men bothering an older lady in broad daylight on the street. There are already people recording with their phones. Do you think that makes you look good?" The young men looked around, and indeed noticed that several pedestrians had their cell phones raised. In the era of social media, being the protagonist of a viral harassment video wasn't something anyone wanted. Besides, Daniel continued, "if you really have a work conflict with the lady, this isn't the place or the way to resolve it. There are legal channels for that. What you're doing here only hurts you." The third young man, who had remained silent until then, murmured something to his companions. Daniel noticed he was the youngest of the 3, probably a minor. "Look," said Daniel, softening his tone, "I understand you might be frustrated if you feel you were treated unfairly, but attacking someone on the street isn't going to fix your situation. It's only going to make it worse." The woman, who had remained silent, spoke for the first time since Daniel arrived. "Young man, I appreciate your intervention, but I can handle this situation." Her voice had a natural authority that surprised everyone, including Daniel. It wasn't the trembling voice of a victim, but that of someone accustomed to taking control of difficult situations. "Of course, ma'am," Daniel responded. "I just wanted to make sure everything was okay." The young man with the cap, evidently uncomfortable with the attention they were receiving, and with Daniel's intervention, made a gesture of disdain. "This isn't over," he muttered, more to save face than as a real threat. The 3 walked away quickly, casting resentful glances back. Daniel waited until they disappeared into the crowd before relaxing his shoulders. "Are you all right?" he asked the woman. She studied him with intelligent and penetrating eyes. She was older than she had seemed from a distance, probably in her 60s, but she maintained herself erect and elegant. Her features showed character,
and Daniel had the strange sensation that he was being evaluated. "I'm perfectly fine, thanks to your intervention," she replied. "It was very brave of you, and very diplomatic. Not many young people would have handled the situation with such elegance." Daniel felt slightly uncomfortable with the praise. Anyone would have done the same. "I'm afraid you're wrong," said the woman with a sad smile. "Most people would have walked by. I know from experience." An awkward silence ensued. Daniel looked at his watch and felt a pang of panic. 5 minutes until the most important interview of his life, and he was still 2 blocks away. "Excuse me," he said hurriedly, "but I have a very important appointment and—" "Of course," the woman interrupted. "Don't let me delay you. But first, allow me to introduce myself. I'm Teresa Morales." She extended her hand, and Daniel shook it briefly. He noticed she wore a ring with a seal that seemed antique and valuable. "Daniel Hernandez," he replied. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Mrs. Morales. I hope you don't have any more problems with those young men." "I'm sure I won't," she said with an enigmatic smile. "Good luck with your appointment, young Hernandez." Daniel nodded quickly, and walked away at an accelerated pace. As he ran the last few meters toward the Innovatex building, he couldn't help wondering who Teresa Morales really was. Something in her way of speaking, in her bearing, indicated she wasn't an ordinary person, but he didn't have time to reflect on it. The interview of his life awaited him. The Innovatex building was a modern 30-story tower that rose like a giant of glass and steel in the heart of Polanco. Its lobby was decorated with elements that mixed modernity and Mexican tradition. Contemporary murals incorporating pre-Hispanic elements, native plants in artisanal ceramic pots, and designer furniture using Mexican woods.
Daniel arrived exactly on time, con flushed cheeks from running and his heart still racing from the previous encounter. The receptionist, an impeccably dressed young woman, smiled professionally at him. "Good morning. Daniel Hernandez. I have an appointment with Mr. Jorge Castillo from Human Resources." "Of course, Mr. Hernandez. Please take a seat. Mr. Castillo will be down in a few minutes." Daniel sat on one of the elegant lobby sofas, trying to calm himself. He mentally reviewed his prepared answers, but his mind constantly drifted to Teresa Morales. There was something familiar about her, though he was sure he had never seen her before. "Mr. Hernandez." A masculine voice pulled him from his thoughts. In front of him stood a man about 45 years old, tall and thin, dressed in an impeccable gray suit. His manners were correct but distant, the kind of professional who had seen thousands of interviews and had developed an armor of civilized courtesy. "I'm Jorge Castillo, Human Resources Manager. A pleasure to meet you." They shook hands and Jorge led him to the elevators. During the journey to the 10th floor, Jorge made polite questions about traffic and weather, but Daniel noticed he was observing him with a critical eye. Every answer was analyzed, every gesture evaluated. The conference room where the interview would take place had a spectacular view of the city. From that height, Mexico City stretched like an infinite ocean of buildings, streets, and intertwined lives. Daniel wondered how many stories like his were unfolding at that very moment down there. "Before we begin," said Jorge as he sat across from Daniel, "I must ask you, why did you arrive exactly on time? Most candidates usually arrive 10 or 15 minutes early." It was an unexpected question. Daniel felt it was a minefield. He couldn't lie, but he also didn't want to give the impression that his priorities weren't focused on the interview. "I arrived with plenty of time in the area," he replied carefully, "but I witnessed a situation on the street that required attention. An elderly person was being bothered by some young men, and I considered it necessary to intervene." Jorge raised an eyebrow. "Intervene how?" "I spoke with them. I convinced them to leave without causing more problems." "I see." Jorge made a note in his pad. "And didn't you consider that this could affect your punctuality for an important interview?" It was a leading question, and Daniel knew it. He could answer yes, that it had been imprudent, and come across as someone who didn't think through the consequences of their actions. Or he could defend his decision, and seem like someone who didn't prioritize appropriately. "I considered both things," he finally replied. "But I arrived on time for the interview, and the person who was being bothered is no longer being bothered. I think you can achieve more than one thing if you organize yourself well." For the first time since they met, Jorge smiled. It wasn't a broad smile, but it was genuine. "Interesting perspective," he said. "Let's talk about your academic experience." The interview flowed for the next hour. Jorge presented hypothetical cases, conflict management situations, questions about leadership and teamwork. Daniel felt he was doing well, that his answers were solid and thoughtful. But there was something more in the dynamic. Jorge seemed to be looking for something specific, something that went beyond the usual technical competencies. His questions focused heavily on values, business ethics, and social responsibility. "Tell me," said Jorge leaning forward, "what do you know about Innovatex's organizational culture?" Daniel had researched exhaustively. He knew about the company's social responsibility programs, about their commitment to indigenous communities, about their sustainability policies.
But more importantly, he knew that all of this wasn't just marketing strategies. Innovatex doesn't just present itself as a technology company, Daniel replied. It presents itself as a Mexican company that uses technology to strengthen the country's traditions and communities. I saw that you have cultural preservation programs, support for indigenous artisans, technology education in rural communities. And does that seem important to you? It seems essential to me, said Daniel without hesitation. A company that forgets its cultural roots can be financially successful, but it will never be truly meaningful. Success without identity is empty. Jorge wrote something else in his pad. Daniel couldn't read what he wrote, but he noticed the manager's expression had softened imperceptibly. One last question, Mr. Hernandez. If I told you this position requires occasionally working with communities that might be skeptical toward private companies, communities that have been hurt by unfulfilled promises in the past, how would you handle that situation? Daniel thought about his own experience.
About his own distrust toward large companies, inherited with one parents who had seen factories close and jobs disappear without explanation. I believe the only way to work with communities that have been hurt is with complete honesty, he replied. I wouldn't promise anything I couldn't deliver. I would listen a lot before speaking, and I would understand that their skepticism is justified by real experiences. Jorge closed his pad and stood up. Mr. Hernandez, this has been a very interesting interview. We'll be in touch within the next week to inform you about the next steps. It was the same phrase Daniel had heard dozens of times before, but something in Jorge's tone gave him hope. It wasn't the automatic "we'll be in touch" from someone who had already made a negative decision. It sounded genuine. They said goodbye in the lobby, and Daniel left the building with a mixture of exhaustion and expectation. He had given his best. The rest didn't depend on him. While waiting for the subway back home, he thought again about Teresa Morales. He wondered if she had arrived safely at her destination, if the young men had left her alone. There was something about her he couldn't forget, a dignity she had maintained even in an uncomfortable situation. Have you ever felt that strange connection with a stranger? That sensation that the encounter means something more than it appears. 3 days later, Daniel received a call he wasn't expecting. Then Mr. Hernandez, this is Clara Mendoza, executive assistant at Innovatex. Mr. Castillo would like you to come in for a second interview. Could you make it tomorrow at 10 in the morning? Daniel almost dropped the phone. A second interview. In 9 months of searching, very few companies had called him back for a second round. Of course, he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. I'll be there. Perfect. This time it will be with a broader panel, including some members of management. The meeting will be on the 15th floor. After hanging up, Daniel sat on his sofa for several minutes, processing the information. A broader panel. Members of management. This was serious. That night he barely slept. He reviewed everything he knew about the company, practiced answers to difficult questions, chose his best shirt, the only one without any visible imperfections. His mother called to wish him luck, and Daniel could hear in her voice the mixture of hope and fear that had accompanied him for months. Son, his mother told him, no matter what happens tomorrow, we're proud of you. You fought so hard. Thank you, Mom, Daniel replied, feeling a lump in his throat. This time is going to be different. I feel it. The next day, Daniel arrived at Innovatex 20 minutes early. This time there would be no surprises on the way. Clara Mendoza received him in the lobby, a woman about 30 years old, impeccably dressed and with an efficiency that bordered on perfection. Good morning, Mr. Hernandez. Would you like coffee before the meeting? Please, Daniel replied. He needed all the help possible to calm his nerves. Clara guided him to the 15th floor, which was noticeably different from the others. While the rest of the building showed standard modern decoration, this floor had its own personality. The walls were decorated with contemporary Mexican art. There were native plants in every corner, and the subtle aroma of copal floated in the air. The board takes corporate culture very seriously, Clara explained as they walked down the hallway. They wanted the executive offices to reflect our values. Daniel nodded, admiring a mural that represented the fusion between modern technology and pre-Hispanic symbols. It was exactly the kind of place where he could imagine himself working. Here we are, said Clara, pointing to a conference room larger than the previous days. The panel members will arrive in a few minutes. Do you need anything else? I'm fine, thank you. Clara left, and Daniel was alone in the room, looking out the windows toward Chapultepec Forest. From that height he could see families strolling among the trees, young couples taking photographs, children running free. It reminded him that life existed beyond offices and suits, beyond constant anxiety about the future. The door opened and Jorge entered, followed by 2 more people. Daniel immediately recognized one of them. It was Teresa Morales. For a moment that seemed eternal, Daniel was paralyzed. Teresa looked at him with the same enigmatic smile she had shown 3 days earlier on the street. But now there was something more in her expression, a mixture of amusement and approval. Mr. Hernandez, said Jorge, oblivious to Daniel's shock,
Allow me to introduce our management team. This is Carmen Reese, our Corporate Human Resources Director. Carmen was a woman about 50 years old with an imposing presence and a warm smile. A pleasure, Mr. Hernandez.
I've heard the very interesting things about you. And this, Jorge continued, is our General Director and founder, Mrs. Teresa Morales. Teresa extended her hand as if they were meeting for the first time. Delighted, Mr. Hernandez. Danielle shook her hand, trying to maintain composure. The pleasure is mine, Mrs. Morales. But in Teresa's eyes there was a gleam that clearly said, let's play along for now. The four sat around the conference table. Danielle tried to concentrate while Jorge explained the interview structure, but his mind was racing. Teresa Morales wasn't just an elegant woman who had been bothered on the street. She was the owner of the company where he wanted to work. The first questions came from Carmen and focused on technical competencies and previous experience. Daniel answered as best he could, but was aware that Teresa was watching him carefully, analyzing not only his words but his body language, his way of handling pressure. Mr. Hernandez, Teresa finally said, I'd like to ask you a different question. In your personal experience, have you had to face situations where you had to choose between your convenience and doing the right thing? It was a loaded question, and Daniel knew intuitively that Teresa was referring to the street encounter without mentioning it directly. I think those situations present themselves more often than we think, Daniel replied carefully. Sometimes they're big and obvious decisions, but most of the time they're small daily choices that reveal our true character. Can you give me an example? Daniel took a deep breath. He could keep talking in general terms, or he could bet big. 3 days ago, on my way to my first interview here, I saw a person being bothered on the street. I could have kept walking so as not to be late, but it didn't seem right to me. I intervened. The situation was resolved peacefully, and I arrived on time for my appointment. Teresa smiled, but it was Carmen who responded. And didn't you consider there might be risks in getting involved in a situation you didn't know all the details about? Of course I considered them, Danielle admitted, but there was a person clearly in a vulnerable position facing several people who were intimidating her. The details were less important than the evident injustice. Jorge and Carmen exchanged glances, but Danielle couldn't interpret their meaning. Teresa, for her part, maintained a neutral expression that revealed nothing. Let's talk about your professional goals, said Jorge, changing the subject. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? It was a classic question, and Danielle had a prepared answer. But after Teresa's question, he decided to be completely honest. I see myself working on projects that have real impact on communities, he replied. I'm not interested in just climbing positions or increasing my salary. I want my work to contribute to making Mexico a better country, especially for people who have had fewer opportunities. And why do you think Innovatex would be the right place to achieve those goals? Asked Teresa. Daniel had researched so much about the company that he could recite all their programs and achievements from memory, but he decided to speak from the heart. Because Innovatex understands that being a successful Mexican company doesn't mean copying foreign models, but creating something authentically ours, he said. I've read about your programs with indigenous communities, about how you've integrated modern technology with traditional techniques. That requires not only technical competence, but true respect and cultural understanding. Have you had experience working with diverse communities? Asked Carmen. The question touched a sensitive nerve in Daniel. I come from a working-class family in Naucalpan, he replied. My father worked 30 years in a textile factory. My mother cleans offices. I know what it means to be seen as less than, by people who assume your value is determined by your zip code or your last name. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but reflective. Teresa leaned slightly forward. How would you handle a situation where you felt you were being judged by your background rather than your capabilities? Daniel smiled for the first time in the entire interview. With respect but without apologizing for who I am, he replied. I've learned that when you try to hide your roots, you lose the authenticity that is your greatest strength. And I've also learned that people who judge you for your background generally reveal more about themselves than about you. Teresa nodded slowly, as if Daniel had confirmed something she already thought. Carmen took the floor. Mr. Hernandez, if we offered you this position, it wouldn't just be an office job. It would involve traveling to remote communities, working with people who might be skeptical toward private companies, mediating conflicts that sometimes have very deep roots. Would that interest you? Daniel's heart began beating faster. They weren't talking in hypotheticals. They were describing a real job, a real opportunity. It would interest me very much, he replied without hesitation. I think working with communities requires humility, patience, and the ability to listen more than you speak. These are qualities I've developed, not in prestigious universities, but in real life. Jorge closed his folder. Mr. Hernandez, do you have any questions for us? Daniel had prepared several intelligent questions about organizational structure and growth plans, But after an hour of genuine conversation, he only had one question that really mattered. What are you really looking for in the person who will fill this position? He asked. I don't mean technical qualifications, but the personal qualities you consider most important. The 3 panel members looked at each other. It was Teresa who responded. We're looking for someone who understands that true business success isn't measured only in numbers, but in the positive impact we generate in people's lives, she said. Someone who has solid values, but who also has the courage to act according to those values, even when it's inconvenient. She paused and looked directly at Daniel. Someone who sees a person in trouble on the street and can't simply keep walking. The message was clear. Teresa not only remembered the encounter from 3 days ago, but it had been an unplanned test that Daniel had passed without knowing it. Anything else? Asked Jorge. Daniel shook his head. I think you've answered everything I needed to know. They stood up and said goodbye cordially. Teresa was the last to shake his hand. Mr. Hernandez, she said in a low voice. It was a pleasure meeting you properly. Likewise, Mrs. Morales, Daniel replied. And I hope you haven't had any more problems with those young men. Teresa smiled. I haven't seen them again, but if I did see them, I'd know exactly what to do. Daniel left the building with a completely different sensation than after the first interview. It wasn't just hope he felt, but a strange certainty that something fundamental had changed in his life. He wouldn't have to wait long to discover what. 2 days later, at 9 in the morning, his phone rang. Mr. Hernandez? This is Clara Mendoza from Innovatex. Could you come in today at 11? Mrs. Morales would like to speak with you. This time it wasn't an interview. It was a conversation. Daniel arrived punctually, and Clara led him directly to Teresa Morales' office on the 20th floor. It was a space that perfectly reflected its occupant. Elegant but not ostentatious, with modern elements combined with authentic Mexican folk art pieces. Teresa was sitting behind a light wood desk, reviewing some documents. She looked up when Daniel entered, and indicated for him to take a seat in one of the comfortable chairs in front of the desk. Thank you for coming, Daniel, she said, using his first name for the first time. I hope you don't mind the informality, but after meeting under such unique circumstances, I think we can dispense with some formalities. Of course, Mrs. Morales. Teresa, please. She leaned back in her chair and studied him with the same intensity she had shown on the street. I'm curious, when you defended me the other day, did you have any idea who I was? None, Daniel replied honestly. I just saw a person who needed help, and if you had known I was the owner of the company where you wanted to work, it was a trap question, and Daniel knew it. I probably would have done exactly the same, he said after thinking about it. But maybe I would have worried more about being late for the interview. Teresa laughed, a genuine and warm laugh. I like your honesty. In my experience, people tend to be less direct when they know I have money or power. She got up from her desk and walked to the window. From her office you could see much of Mexico City extending to the horizon. Do you know how old I am, Daniel? She asked without turning around. I wouldn't dare guess, ma'am. Teresa, 64. I founded Innovatex 34 years ago, when female entrepreneurs were a rarity, and companies that talked about social responsibility were seen as unserious. She turned toward him. I've seen thousands of candidates over all these decades. I've hired brilliant graduates from prestigious universities, people with master's degrees abroad, consultants with international experience. She paused. Many of them were excellent employees. Some became part of management, but very few truly understood what this company's mission meant. She returned to her seat. Do you know what the people who have contributed most to Innovatex's growth have in common? Daniel shook his head. All, without exception, were people who demonstrated their values through actions, not through words. People who, when they were alone and no one was watching, made decisions that revealed their true character. The message was clear, but Daniel didn't want to assume anything. The position you applied for, Teresa continued, is more complex than you probably imagine. It won't just be coordinating social responsibility programs. It will be representing me in situations where the company must make difficult decisions. It will be working with communities that have been deceived before, and will initially distrust you. It will be maintaining Innovatex's values even when that means sacrificing short-term profits. She leaned forward. Do you think you can handle that kind of pressure? Daniel thought about the last 9 months, about the failed interviews, about the sleepless nights wondering if he would ever find his place in the professional world, about the constant pressure of knowing his parents had sacrificed so much for his education. Teresa, he finally said, I can't promise you I'll never make mistakes or that I'll have all the answers, but I can promise you I'll always give my best, that I'll never compromise my principles for convenience, and that I'll treat every person with the dignity they deserve, regardless of their social or economic position. Teresa smiled and opened the folder that was on her desk. Daniel Hernandez, she said formally. I'm pleased to offer you the position of Coordinator of Social Impact and Community Development Programs at Innovatex. Daniel felt the world stop. After 9 months of rejections, of doubts, of nights wondering if he would ever find his place, he finally had an answer. I accept, he said, and his voice sounded firmer than he felt. Excellent, Teresa replied. You'll start Monday. Clara will give you all the administrative details, but I wanted to speak personally with you about your first assignments. She opened another thicker folder. We have a program in development with 3 indigenous communities in the state of Oaxaca. We've been working with them for 2 years to implement sustainable technology that complements their traditional agricultural practices. It's a complex project that requires tremendous cultural sensitivity. Daniel nodded, absorbing the information. We also plan to expand our educational scholarship program for young people from rural communities. We currently offer 20 annual scholarships, but we want to increase that to 150 over the next 3 years. Teresa closed the folder and looked at him directly. But your first assignment is going to be something different. In 2 weeks we have a visit from international investors, who are considering financing the expansion of several of our programs. They'll come with their own ideas about how we should handle social responsibility. Your job will be to ensure they understand what our vision really is and why it's important. What kind of ideas do they bring? Daniel asked. The kind of ideas that sound very good in PowerPoint presentations but ignore the reality of the communities we work with, Teresa replied with a tone that revealed years of experience with this type of situation. They think efficiency means standardizing everything, that progress means abandoning traditions, that success is measured solely in ROI. Daniel began to understand the magnitude of what he was being entrusted with. And if I don't manage to convince them, then we'll look for other funding sources, Teresa replied without hesitation. A lesson I learned many years ago. It's better to grow slowly while maintaining your values, than to grow quickly but lose your soul. The phone on Teresa's desk rang. Clara's voice came through the speaker. Teresa, the representatives from the San Miguel Tilquiapan community are asking to speak with you about the solar energy project. Perfect timing, Teresa said to Daniel. Would you like to observe your first work meeting? The representatives from San Miguel Tilquiapan were received in a special conference room that Teresa had designed specifically for meetings with community leaders. Instead of the typical formal conference setup, there were comfortable sofas arranged in a circle, decorations that honored different Mexican cultures, and always available refreshments that included both modern options and traditional drinks. Daniel sat discreetly to one side while Teresa, accompanied by Carmen from Human Resources, received 3 community representatives: Don Aurelio, an older man with impressive dignity, Doña Esperanza, a middle-aged woman whose eyes showed both warmth and determination, and Emilio, a young man about Daniel's age, who served as a translator between generations within the community. Don Aurelio, Doña Esperanza, Emilio. Teresa greeted them, standing up and greeting each one with genuine respect. How good to see you again. How are the families? Small talk flowed naturally for several minutes. Daniel observed how Teresa asked specific questions about individuals she clearly knew. Man Aurelio's grandson who was studying in the capital, Doña Esperanza's daughter who recently had a baby, Emilio's project to preserve traditional weaving techniques. Have you noticed how some people have the gift of making everyone feel important and valued? Teresa had that gift. Well, Don Aurelio eventually said, we've come to discuss some concerns about the solar energy project. Teresa's expression became more serious but remained open and welcoming. Please tell me everything. Emilio spoke first. Some community members are worried that this technology will change too many things. They've seen other villages where modern improvements ended up dividing people, creating conflicts. Daniel listened carefully. This was exactly the kind of complex situation that Teresa had described, where good intentions could have unintended consequences if not handled with extreme care. I understand those concerns perfectly, Teresa responded. What specific changes are they most worried about? Doña Esperanza answered. The young families want electricity for better educational opportunities for their children, internet access, better lighting for studying, but the older families worry that this will make the young people want to leave the community permanently. It was a very real tension. Daniel could see it. Rural communities constantly facing the difficult choice between preserving traditional ways of life and providing opportunities for future generations. And what do you think? Asked Teresa. What would be the ideal solution? Don Aurelio spoke thoughtfully. We need to find a way for technology to serve our community without changing our identity, but we don't know if that's possible. Teresa nodded and turned toward Daniel. I'd like to introduce you to Daniel Hernandez. He's our new Social Impact Programs Coordinator. He'll be working closely with me on these projects. Daniel felt a moment of nerves but maintained composure as he greeted the 3 representatives. Emilio looked at him with particular curiosity, probably assessing whether this new person would be another bureaucrat who didn't understand rural realities. Daniel, said Teresa, what do you think about what we've discussed? It was a test, Daniel knew. his first chance to demonstrate his understanding and approach. I think that, Daniel began carefully, any technological solution that doesn't respect and strengthen existing community bonds is destined to fail. The question isn't if we should implement solar technology, but how we can implement it in a way that actually reinforces what makes San Miguel Tilquiapan strong as a community. Emilio raised an eyebrow, clearly interested. Like what? For example, Daniel continued, building confidence as his thoughts organized. Instead of installing individual systems in each home, what if we designed a community-based system where maintenance and management require collaboration? Where accessing electricity requires participating in community decisions? Don Aurelio leaned forward. Explain more. Imagine a system where every month, all families must attend a community meeting to discuss not only technical maintenance, but also how the technology is being used. Are children using internet access for learning? Are families finding new ways to combine traditional practices with modern opportunities? Doña Esperanza smiled slightly. So the technology becomes a reason for bringing people together, not for separating them. Exactly, said Daniel with growing enthusiasm. And we could design training programs where older community members teach younger ones about traditional skills, while younger members teach older ones about using new technology, creating interdependence instead of division. Teresa observed this entire exchange with evident satisfaction. It was clear that Daniel wasn't just making theoretical suggestions, he was thinking through real solutions that honored both progress and tradition. It's an interesting approach, admitted Don Aurelio. But would your company accept this kind of complications? It's easier to give technology and leave. Teresa answered before Daniel could. Don Aurelio, if we want it easy, we would be a different kind of company. We're interested in creating lasting partnerships, not quick installations. The meeting continued for another hour, with participants gradually developing a more detailed plan that addressed the community's concerns while maintaining technological benefits. Daniel found himself contributing regularly, his ideas being taken seriously by everyone present. When the representatives finally left, with plans for follow-up meetings and a clear path forward, Teresa turned to Daniel. What did you learn from this meeting? She asked. That every community has its own internal dynamics, and no outside solution will work unless it takes those dynamics into account, Daniel responded. Also that people aren't resistant to change itself, they're resistant to changes that threaten what they value most. Correct. And what else? Daniel thought deeper, that my job isn't to convince communities to accept our programs, it's to understand what they need, and then figure out how our resources can serve those needs. Teresa smiled with approval. Now you're beginning to understand why this work is so complex, and why it's necessary. Over the following weeks, Daniel threw himself into his new role with a passion that surprised even himself. Every day brought new challenges, new communities, new problems to solve. He traveled to rural villages where internet connectivity was changing how young people saw their life options. He worked with urban indigenous communities who were trying to maintain traditional practices while adapting to city jobs and schedules. He attended meetings with government officials who promised support but delivered bureaucratic obstacles, and he learned to navigate those obstacles without losing sight of community needs. But his biggest challenge came sooner than expected. 3 weeks into his new position, Teresa called him into her office on a Friday afternoon. Daniel, she said, remember the international investors I mentioned during your first day? Yes, Daniel replied, immediately feeling a knot in his stomach. They're arriving Monday, and our presentation to them has been moved up due to their schedule changes. Instead of having 2 weeks to prepare, you have this weekend. Teresa handed him a thick folder. These are their profiles, their previous investments, what they say they're looking for, and what they're actually looking for. Daniel opened the folder, and quickly scanned the materials. The investors represented a consortium of European and American venture capital firms, with billions under management. They were considering a $50 million investment in Innovatex's social programs. That's, Daniel paused, processing the numbers. That's more money than all our current programs combined. Yes, said Teresa gravely. It could allow us to help thousands more families, create hundreds more jobs, expand our educational programs exponentially. But, Daniel sensed there was more. But, Teresa sighed and sat back in her chair. They want to optimize our impact metrics and streamline our community engagement protocols. Even without knowing all the details, Daniel understood the concern. Those phrases were corporate speak for standardizing processes, reducing face-to-face interaction, and prioritizing measurable outputs over meaningful relationships. What exactly do they want to change? He asked. Teresa opened another folder on her desk. Instead of our current approach of spending months getting to know each community before implementing programs, they want us to deploy proven solutions that can be implemented across multiple communities simultaneously. Daniel felt his stomach sink further. Instead of customized training programs that respect local traditions, they want to use scalable online modules that can reach more people more efficiently.
and instead of our current community leadership development approach, they want to work with approved local partners, which generally means local politicians or wealthy families who can guarantee quick results. Daniel closed the folders and looked directly at Teresa. So they want to eliminate everything that makes our programs actually work. In their minds, they want to eliminate everything that makes our programs inefficient, corrected Teresa. They're not evil people, Daniel. They genuinely believe that their approach will help more people. But do you agree? Teresa was quiet for a long moment. I've built this company over 35 decades by never accepting money that came with strings that would compromise our values, she said finally. But I'm also responsible for all our employees, all the families we're currently helping, and all the communities that trust us. She looked out her window toward the city sprawling below. If I reject this investment, we'll continue helping people but slowly. We could take 10 years to reach the communities we could reach in 2 years with their funding. Daniel understood the weight of the decision. It was the classic dilemma of maintaining principles versus maximizing impact. But if we accept their terms, we could help thousands more people initially. But each community would receive less personalized attention, less culturally appropriate solutions, and probably less sustainable results. Teresa turned back toward Daniel.